Thank you for inviting me for the talk. Just click on the button.
The clicker?
Yeah. So I'm going to be talking on dissolvable metallic implants, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Wichita State University. I was told to keep my talk very non-technical, so it is non-technical. Anybody of you wants the technical details, I'll be more than happy to talk more offline. Just briefly touching upon the rationale of our work, coronary artery disease is one of the leading causes of death in the United States. One of the causes of, the main causes of coronary artery disease is the narrowing of the artery, which leads to restricted blood flow and could cause a heart attack. So one of the ways in which depends on the severity, of course, of the blockage, but one of the ways that this is treated is through the use of coronary stents. And I don't know if you can see it clearly. That's just, and I'm not too tech savvy. Is there a pointer here?
The green line on top, the top button.
So that would be a kind of representative artery that is has a blockage in it, and you use a device called stents, which is essentially a small metallic mesh-like structure that is essentially positioned at the blocked artery through a catheter, balloon-tipped catheter, and then the deflated balloon is inflated, expanding the stent, and then the balloon is again deflated and pulled out while the stent remains in place, holding the artery open. Now, there are a couple of challenges in terms of this technology. One of the challenges here is the recurrence of something called a stent restenosis, which is re-narrowing of the artery. Essentially, as the artery, the stent expands, the artery kind of treats it more like an injury, and the biological pathways that result essentially leads to re-narrowing of the artery over time. So in order to address that, the current technology is the use of something called as a drug-eluting stents, where essentially they load a drug in a polymer coating, which essentially prevents the formation of restenosis at that time frame. These devices are essentially permanent devices, which means they remain in the body, after the restenosis occurred and the drugs have taken care of that. They remain in the body permanently. So essentially, it's a permanent fixture. One of the challenges of this device is that there could be blood clots forming around the stents, and the patient has to then take blood thinners throughout the lifetime to prevent formation of blood clots. And if there is a recurrence in clogging of the artery in the future, you would have difficulties in inserting a second stent within the same artery due to presence of that particular stent. Okay. Most clinicians and researchers agree that stent is really not needed in the artery beyond a 12 to 18 months time frame. The purpose of the device essentially, is done within that time frame, and after that, it's just there as a device, and essentially you wouldn't go back to get the stent out. So there's a lot of research being done in seeing what is the alternate of a permanent stent and looking into something called as biodegradable stents. But just to give the audience an idea, these are some of the current metals that are being used as stents, with 316L stainless steel, which is a medical grade stainless steel, being essentially the gold standard for stents. So what we have done is we have looked into developing, magnesium-based dissolvable metallic stents. So essentially, what would we have is you would have a metal stent, as the case is the permanent stents, but over time that metal would disintegrate, dissolve into the body, and after the time frame we're looking into, 12 to 18 months, you would have that entire device disintegrated and absorbed by the body. So you would have an artery that's free of any medical devices. So magnesium is a material under consideration for the dissolver metal stents. Some advantages: it is biodegradable. It disintegrates within the physiological environment. It's biocompatible if the degradation is essentially controlled, it has the appropriate mechanical properties for its suitability for using as a cardiovascular stent. One of the main disadvantages is it degrades too fast. So rather than being present in the body for 12 to 18 months, it disintegrates within 3 to 4 months of time frame. So what we have done is we have developed proprietary coatings essentially to control the degradation stent and have other features that would be more applicable for the cardiovascular stent applications. That is the ability to load drugs and everything. I've not gone too much into the technical details of our technology, but just on the right, quick timelines on intellectual property related to our work. We filed a US provisional patent, then we were awarded an international patent, and then we just recently filed for a US patent in May 2016. So if you can just look this up, pretty much you'll have all the details of our technology, and that's on the web right now. In talking a little bit about the market, the currently stents is an $8 billion annual market. I may have to refer to the slides. I can't read the slides, so sorry. As of 2014, it's an $8 billion market projected to grow to about over 10 million by 2019. That market is essentially broken down into the bare metallic stent market, which is without the drug-eluting stents, which is about 3 billion, and the remaining is for the drug-eluting stent market. Now, I don't know if you can see that. That's just some details on the current, competitors or major players in the stent market. You have Medtronic, Abbott, Boston Scientific. So these are some of the major players in the stent market, and that just tells you, what their market share is in the stent market. Here you can see, how the market is distributed. You still have, the major one stents is the drug-eluting stents. You still have a little bit of permanent stents, but the one in the green is the one on absorbable stents. That is the degradable stents. But those absorbable stents is essentially made of polymers, not metallic stents. They're essentially polymer-based degradable stents. So currently there are no players in the market in biodegradable metallic stents. But of course we envision some of the major players to be competitors down the future. There's one company called Biotronic, that have currently a magnesium-based stents that is in process in the clinical trials. And they've been at it for 10 years, but still we don't have a product in the marketplace. And one of the reasons being is currently there are no standards. FDA is a regulatory body that approves medical devices, and stent is considered a high-risk class 3 medical device. Currently, since there's no product in biodegradable metals, there are no current standards to evaluate these products. So that's one of the challenges in getting the product on market, other than the fact that a lot of clinical trials are needed to prove efficacy of the product. So here, in terms of what's happening from a competitive standpoint, there's, to the best of my knowledge, only Biotronic is the one company that has a magnesium-based product somewhere in the research, development, clinical trial process. And this was, I just saw this article in 2015 article that they did a clinical trial, a magnesium-based product, and they showed, the product really did well in that sense. So the point of this is magnesium-based stents is something that's seriously considered as something that you could see down the road in terms of biodegradable metallic stents. So where are we in terms of current development and what we are doing? Of course, we have secured the technology. We have got the international patent and the U.S. patent is pending. We have secured some funds to actually hire a regulatory consultant who would come and look at our product, and we have identified the consultant. So they would come and look at our product and identify what are the steps in terms of testing and other things that would be required to get and apply for an FDA approval for these stents. Just put the standard, funding sources. It's a high-risk, high-return technology, which means a lot of money is required to take the product to the market place. We are imagining, as we get through the regulatory consultant, we'll be at a stage where we're applying for federal money, which is SBR, STTIR money, to carry out some of those tests. We have demonstrated feasibility, but we would have to do the actual test that would be required as a part of the FDA approval process. And at that stage, we are hoping to be competitive for VC funding, to get it to market. And in this kind of industry, once you get an FDA approval, you're more likely to get bought up by a larger company. This kind of established protocol. I'm sorry, I'm out of time. This kind of established protocol. With that, I'm pretty much done, and I'll happy to answer any questions. Can I go too much over time? Sorry, thank you very much. Hopefully didn't go too much over time.
So you asked me on there about the biodegradable polymers. You mentioned the biodegradable polymers, at least in your slide. Can you say more about what their competition is, or the hybrid between metallic and polymer for drug release?
So the biodegradable polymer stents currently don't have the properties that would be required of a metallic stents, you can imagine, in terms of properties. So the challenges, you require higher struts of the stents. Also, you're not able to image the stents as you're trying to deploy the stents in the place. So there are a lot of challenges in that sense. That's why you see the market share is still pretty low compared to permanent stents.
Does magnesium in any way decrease restenosis? Have you have any studies on that?
Magnesium on its own does not decrease stenosis. You still have to use the drug loaded in there, and that's like pretty much a standard for any other metallic. So that would not be where we are differing from the technology-wise.
And I guess I missed, maybe I slipped away mentally for a minute. Are you talking about developing this entire stent and trying to bring that to market?
No, so we have developed proprietary coatings. So we'll still
Just
be
the
using
coating.
a magnesium base,
Okay.
and we have developed coatings that would be deposited on the magnesium to degrade the corrosion rate. And within that coatings, we'll incorporate application-specific strategies. So for the case of stents, that would be drugs loaded to prevent stenosis. This technology also is being looked into other applications, such as bone screws, where the coatings could be tailored accordingly.
I thought that's what I understood, and then I thought you said you were going to apply for FDA use, but the only way it's going to be used is on a currently extant stent, a stent that currently exists. You're going to sell the coating.
So magnesium is a pure element, so you can't patent magnesium.
Right.
So we're going to take the whole device, and that's the one we are going to seek for approval.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So if anybody has a couple of $1 million.
Here's a question. When is the NIH funding coming from?
Pardon?
When is the NIH with respect to something like this?
So, like I said, the established model in this high-risk, high-return technology is you go through some of the federal resources for proving. So in order to get it to the market, you got to go through animal trials, you got to go to clinical trials. So essentially, you're being vetted through the process before you want to get to the FDA approval process. So the federal funding, the talk was a part of my presentation that I did to some VC firms about 4 years ago, part of the talk. And what they recommended is to go after the SBR, STTIR funding. And at that point, it would be more competitive for VC funding, where they would come in to do predominantly clinical trials and try to get it out to the FDA approval process. But NIH is the one that will come in for the early stage and possibly animal trials get funded. Thank you very much.